Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here again with my good friend Thomas Farrar to discuss countering annihilationism. This will be a two-part series. In this first part, we're going to be looking at preliminary theological considerations, the Old Testament and ancient Second Temple Jewish literature, and we'll say part two for the New Testament. Thomas, I got all that right. Is that correct?
Spot on.
All right.
Thanks, Suan.
Well, Thomas, I'm excited to have you back on to talk about this. It's been a while since I've thought about this issue. So I think you have a paper actually on academia.edu that people can find. It's called Countering Annihilationism, a Response to the Fire That Consumes by Edward W. Fudge. And I just want to say that one thing I admire about this paper that you wrote is that you take, I'll just call him Mr. Fudge, you take him very seriously. And, obviously you point out that he put a lot of work and thought into this, and you want to give him that due diligence. And also, it's the late Edward W. Fudge, which is worth noting. Thomas, maybe before we start, I don't know if this is part of the presentation, but what got you into this subject?
Yeah, it will be dealt with in the presentation, but briefly, we've discussed before on your channel my Christadelphian background and how I journeyed from that to Catholicism. And Christadelphianism is an annihilationist movement. So I was raised with annihilationism as part of my belief system. Now, after having become Catholic and obviously through catechesis, being aware of what the Catholic Church teaches, which is not annihilationism, as we'll see, that I think it's quite an emotive issue. And some of my Catholic family and friends, one individual in particular, kind of challenged me on it and said, are you really prepared to accept the Catholic teaching on hell as opposed to the annihilationism that you were raised with? So up until that time, when I was issued sort of with that challenge, I'd thought a fair bit about hell, but I'd never written anything on it really. And I think that challenge compelled me to go into it a little bit deeper. And we'll see how I came to Mr. Fudge's book. That was part of that journey. So I felt like, it's something that needs a response.
Yeah, well, I look forward to it. I mean, last time we talked about, I think it was the deity of Christ in the New Testament, and then, or even I think it was the whole Trinity actually. Yeah, because we talked about the Holy Spirit as well, and then yeah, we talked about Christadelphianism. So, I mean, every time you present, you always take it out of the park. So I'm very excited for this.
Oh, thanks for that
All
nice
right.
baseball analogy.
Whenever you're ready, Thomas, just go right ahead. And throughout, you might ask me a question. I might interject here and there, and we'll try to keep it interactive.
Sounds good. Okay, so you'll see that the title I've picked here is Countering Annihilationism. And I just mentioned to you about this challenge that I received after having become a Catholic from a Christadelphian relative who asked me whether I really prepared to accept Catholic teaching on hell, given that Christadelphians are conditionalists and annihilationists. We'll get into the definition of those terms shortly. So, in a bit of wider context, apart from, Christadelphians, which many, even Protestants, would regard as kind of a fringe movement, a sect, if you will. Nonetheless, annihilationism has actually been gaining a lot of ground in evangelicalism in the past few decades. And you could say it's been displacing traditional Christian teaching on hell in many circles. You could say, Christadelphian, Seventh-day Adventist, Jehovah's Witnesses, some of these new religious movements that arose in the 1800s were annihilationists before it was cool. But evangelicals have kind of come to the party in that respect. So the traditional doctrine that is being displaced to some degree was received by Protestants from the Catholic Church. So for most of the post-Reformation history, most Protestants would have agreed with what the Catholic Church teaches on hell. Not on purgatory, mind you, but that's a different subject, but on hell itself, yes. So now that's basically changing, especially in the last few decades. So the question that arises then is, where does that leave us as Catholics? And I think that broadens the challenge to not just someone like me that's come out of a sort of a fringe movement or a fundamentalist sect, but any evangelical, any Catholic that is engaging with Protestants, engaging with evangelical Protestants in particular, or a new Catholic that has come from a Protestant background, will face challenging questions around the issue of hell and annihilationism. So the question is, where does that leave us as Catholics? Should we be embarrassed about the church's teaching that is now becoming unfashionable? Or is it something that is intellectually defensible? So before we look at whether it's defensible, we need to know what we're talking about, what actually is Catholic teaching on hell. So, and this teaching is what conditionalists refer to as either traditionalism or eternal conscious torment, which can be abbreviated as ECT. So we might use those terms interchangeably as we go. But I'll just give two quotations from Catholic catechisms. The first one is from the Roman Catechism, the second from the more recent Catechism of the Catholic Church. So the first one, Roman Catechism, Article 5, states, among the abodes called hell is that most loathsome and dark prison in which the souls of the damned are tormented with the unclean spirits in eternal and inextinguishable fire. This place is called Gehenna, the bottomless pit, and is hell strictly so called. So that's quite a sort of graphic description. And then in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we have the following: that the teaching of the Church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Immediately after death, the souls of those who die in a state of mortal sin descend into hell, where they suffer the punishments of hell, eternal fire. The chief punishment of hell is eternal separation from God, in whom alone man can possess the life and happiness for which he was created and for which he longs, end quote. So it's clear that the Catholic Church teaches that hell exists and that it is eternal. It's an unending punishment for those who enter there. Now, it's worth mentioning that there is some debate within the Catholic Church over this issue of whether we may hope that hell is empty. So one can, without committing heresy, one can hope that hell is actually empty. One cannot presume or know that hell is empty. That would then be universalism, which the Catholic Church regards as a heresy. But, Catholic theologians like Hans Urs von Balthasar is one of those who have taught recently in the 20th century that we may hope that hell is empty. And, there are prominent Catholic theologians today on both sides of the issue, like Bishop Robert Barron on the one side, Ralph Martin on the other side. There's many others, but that's not our subject this evening. How many people might end up in hell is not our subject this evening, but rather what is hell and what does the punishment of hell entail? So then, what are conditionalism and annihilationism, these opposing viewpoints to the Catholic Church's teaching? So the evangelical conditionalist website, rethinkinghell.com, defines conditionalism this way. It entails rejecting the notion, quote, that all human beings are naturally immortal, and affirming that it is only through receiving the benefits of Christ's victory over death that any person can be made alive forever, which Scripture only describes as being given to those who are saved. Therefore, since immortality will not be granted to unsaved human beings, we see no way for them to have ongoing life or conscious existence, end quote. So essentially, conditionalism is the idea that immortality, defined as endless existence, is not something that all humans experience or will experience, but only those who are saved will experience that, while the unsaved will pass out of existence, which is the sort of corollary of conditionalism that is called annihilationism. So the notion that the punishment of the unsaved will be or result in the end of their existence is what we mean by annihilationism. I see that I've spelled it wrong on the slide. Annihilationism and conditionalism usually go hand in hand, although you could argue that conditionalism does not imply annihilationism, because God could keep a resurrected person in existence indefinitely for the purpose of punishment. Now, I wanted to take, coming back to this challenge that I sought to respond to, and in terms of whether the Catholic teaching is defensible, I wanted to take a steelman approach. I didn't want to go on hearsay or risk a straw man approach. And from asking around, and also from reading some scholars that endorse this book, I found that what's considered to be sort of the standard defense of annihilationism is a book by the late Edward W. Fudge, who lived from 1944 to 2017. And the book is titled "The Fire That Consumes: A Biblical and Historical Study of the Doctrine of Final Punishment." And its third and final edition was published in 2011 by Wipf and Stock, 593 pages. So to give a bit of background on this book, it was originally published, its first edition, in 1982. And there's a story behind the book that I won't go into, but a film was made about Mr. Fudge's life called Hell and Mr. Fudge. And basically, he undertook a study on the subject of hell, and it led him to change his mind and adopt annihilationism. And he faced a lot of personal and professional difficulties because of taking that position that was not popular among most of his peers. So the three editions of the book have had forewords from some pretty top ranked scholars: F.F. Bruce, John Wenham, and Richard Bauckham, the third edition. And to quote Bauckham, he declares the book to be the fullest and most thorough exposition and defense of the view that the fate of the unsaved will be final destruction, not, as in the traditional doctrine of hell, eternal torment. So that's pretty high praise from a scholar of Bauckham's caliber. Fudge himself was a Church of Christ minister and later a lawyer, as he basically was forced out of the ministry after he took this annihilationist position. He was generally charitable in his interactions with evangelical traditionalists, but generally also saw very little merit in their position. So just to give a broad overview of the content of the book, chapters 1 to 10, which is what we're going to be looking at really in this portion of the series, covers an introduction, Old Testament and Jewish background. And that also includes some overarching epistemological and hermeneutical matters, in addition to the Old Testament witness itself, and a survey of Second Temple Jewish literature. Then chapters 11 to 23 look at the New Testament witness, with Jesus' teachings treated thematically and the rest of the New Testament divided up by book. And then there are 2 chapters on the implications of Jesus' death. That's a particular argument that the book makes. Then chapters 24 to 34 look at church history, and then chapters 35 to 36 draw conclusions. So to preface the remarks that I'm going to make on the book, as Suan, you already mentioned in the beginning, this presentation is an abridgment of a 63-page article that's been published on my academia.edu page. And full reference information for the quotations in the presentation can be found there. The article also has an index of citations of biblical and other ancient literature for easy reference. And also note that biblical quotations both in the article and here in the presentation, are taken from the New Revised Standard Version updated edition unless otherwise indicated. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to dive into the book, but before doing so, I'll just pause, Swan, in case you have any comments or questions.
Well, one thing I remember from your paper was that you mentioned Mr. Fudge is working from a Protestant framework. And when you mentioned that you're going to look at the Old Testament, you mean the Old Testament that we as Catholics share with Protestants. Is that correct? Or are you also going to include our Old Testament?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point that I will touch on in a couple of slides from now.
Cool.
In a bit more detail.
Yeah,
but,
well, then go right on ahead.
Well spotted. All right. Okay, so in chapter 1, Fudge wonders whether a deeper widespread problem with the traditional interpretation of hell could be behind the disappearance of hell from public preaching. So this is a phenomenon that I think is fairly widely noted, say in the Western world, that Sunday sermons and other public preaching tend not to be fire and brimstone, say of the Jonathan Edwards 18th century type. Eternal fire is not something you hear a lot about in most Sunday services at churches. And so Fudge is asking the question, could the reason for this decline in preaching about hell be that, in fact, the traditional doctrine of hell is flawed and preachers are increasingly aware of this and therefore embarrassed to preach on the subject? But I would pose the question, whether fire and brimstone preaching is any more popular in annihilationist settings. So if you went into a church that is annihilationist in its teaching, would you be more likely to hear a lot of fire and brimstone teaching there than in a traditionalist church? And, you know, it's open for debate, but in my own experience, having been raised in an annihilationist movement, there wasn't a lot of fire and brimstone preaching there either. So that suggests to me that it's something wider or broader that's going on in the culture that is leading to a downplaying of eschatological punishment in general, and not something that is specific to the traditional doctrine of hell. Now, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell famously decried Christian teaching on hell as a doctrine of cruelty. And in Western societies, capital punishment in the criminal law has been either banned outright or restricted and made less painful in pretty much every country in the West. And if you compare that to the New Testament, Jesus' teachings contain references to public execution and graphic execution methods like being cut in half or having a millstone bound around your neck and you be thrown into the sea. So I think one would have to admit that even on an annihilationist worldview, there is a sharp disconnect between prevailing Western values about punishment and biblical ideas about eschatological punishment. I don't think there's anyone in the West today, or at least not many people, who could read about being cut in half or thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck and say, yeah, you know, that's pretty normal. That's something I'd sign up to in terms of our criminal code. So there's obviously a disconnect. And so I don't think one can pin that on the traditional doctrine of hell, because even if you become an annihilationist, that disconnect doesn't go away. Now, coming to the point you raised a moment ago, Swan, in chapter 2, Fudge nails his Protestant colors to the mast, including sola scriptura and a strong rejection of papal authority. Now, the difference in the Old Testament canon is also significant because Fudge actually acknowledges that the book of Judith teaches ECT. And of course, this book is part of the Catholic Old Testament. it's canonical for Catholics. And so if Judith is in fact canonical authoritative scripture, then if Fudge admits that it teaches ECT, then that's pretty decisive in the debate. But in order for us to go on and not really be too bogged down over these debates over the canon, which is not our subject, let us accept Protestant presuppositions for the sake of argument. And so we will be working with the 39-book Protestant Old Testament from here on, although we will come back and mention Judith as part of Second Temple Jewish literature.
Okay. I was about to say, should I read the quote from Judith, or should we save that for later?
I think we can save it. It's going to be on one of the slides.
All right.
Okay, so in chapter 3, Fudge defends the doctrine of conditional immortality, also known as conditionalism, which we've already defined. But conditionalism is necessary for annihilationism, but arguably not sufficient for annihilationism, because if you adopt a conditionalist anthropology, you could still say that wicked humans will be resurrected and then exist forever in a state of punishment. So they would be granted unending existence after their resurrection, and not because it is part of human nature, so to speak. So because of that, I would argue that the conditionalism debate is not decisive for the annihilationist debate. However, it's still worth going into conditionalism a little bit, because in my experience, if you had a Venn diagram of conditionalism and annihilationism, there's a huge intersection between the two. I don't think there are a lot of conditionalists, or rather annihilationists, that are not conditionalists. So we're going to look at a few semantic issues around the topic of conditionalism. Now, the Hebrew words nephesh and the Greek word psyche are both multivalent words, meaning that they have a lot of meanings. And these are the words that would, if you find the word soul in your English Bible, if it's in the Hebrew Bible, it's probably translating nephesh. And in the New Testament, the word soul is probably translating psyche. Generally, neither word is used in the Bible in the sense that theologians use the word soul when we use the expression immortality of the soul. So if a theologian speaks of the immortality of the soul, that English word, the meaning of soul that is used in that expression is not a meaning that either of those Hebrew or Greek words normally has in the Bible, or arguably ever has in the Bible. So that's one point worth noting. A second point worth noting is that terms like life, death, and immortality are not value neutral in the Bible like existence. So the word life entails a state of blessedness, a state of beatitude, and death is a curse. To undergo death is to be accursed. That's very important to keep in mind, because annihilationists sometimes want to regard the word life as synonymous with existence, and death as therefore synonymous with non-existence. And I don't think biblically that is the case. So for instance, Scripture frequently speaks of the possibility of being dead in a more fundamental sense, even while technically being alive in the sense of mere existence. And just to quote a couple of passages in that regard, the famous saying of Jesus in Luke 9, verse 60, "Let the dead bury their own dead." And in 1 Timothy 5, verse 6, it says, "The widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives." So I think any annihilationist would acknowledge that there is a figurative sense of dead used in the Bible. So I don't think that's a point of controversy. And I would concede that while immortality of the soul is a tried and true theological term, and I think it's used in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it is perhaps an unhelpful term if those two nouns, immortality and soul, are understood in the biblical sense of these nouns. So in other words, immortality of the soul, I think, names a true doctrine of the church, a doctrine that is true, but I don't think that the word immortality or the word soul, when used in defining that doctrine, is being used in the sense that the words immortality and soul typically occur in English translations of the Bible. And I think that potentially creates a lot of confusion around the issue. So immortality, as we said previously, in the Bible is not a value neutral state. Like it doesn't just mean perpetual existence. It means perpetual blessedness. It is a reward to granted to the redeemed. So it's not a value neutral term like existence. And we've also mentioned that soul is I think a philosophical, technical term in anthropological discourse, and is not mostly when we find the English word soul in our Bible translations is not referring to that technical philosophical term. But we should also bear in mind what, you could argue that I've made a pretty big concession here by saying that effectively the term immortality of the soul, if those two nouns are used in their biblical sense, is not really a helpful term. But there are corollaries of that concession that are also problematic for annihilationists. The first one is proof texts about souls dying or immortality being conferred do not disprove the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, because we are conceding that when a scripture refers to a soul dying, it is not using the word soul in the way that we are using it when we refer to the immortality of the soul, and therefore it's irrelevant in terms of disproving the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. Similarly, a passage that would refer to immortality being conferred on people does not imply that those on whom it is not conferred must cease to exist, because again, immortality is not merely synonymous with perpetual existence in a value neutral sense. It is an eternal state of blessedness, eternal life. And you could argue that conditional immortality is equally a misnomer, because conditionalists, that is a term that they use for their own doctrine, conditional immortality, but they are also using immortality here in a value neutral sense, and not merely to refer to an eternal state of blessedness, because everyone agrees that immortality in the sense of an eternal state of blessedness is conditional and is not something that's granted to everyone. Okay, unless you're a universalist, right? But conditionalists, when they refer to conditional immortality, what they really mean is conditional perpetual existence, right? They are distinguishing themselves from traditionalists in that they do not believe perpetual existence is something that it is granted to all. So I might just pause here in case you have any comments or questions on those points.
Yeah, I think you're making a very important but subtle distinction here when you say the immortality of the soul. When we look at that phrase, we interpret that with the proper philosophical kind of understanding that the church wants us to have of that term. But then when you look at, as you said, immortality, or even the words that are used for soul in the original languages, it means something slightly different. So it's almost like, how do I put it? The way in which the church has distilled the doctrine and named it, so to speak, it's correct. And in our modern verbiage, right, the way that we speak, it maps on right. But when we go back to the original context and we're translating right from these original biblical languages, we need to be a bit more careful, right? Even though the church got to the right conclusion, that I mean, that's at least what we believe. Um, we can't just think, oh, we look at the text and do a straightforward like English translation and think that's exactly how the biblical authors are writing or using their language. You're not saying that that means it's wrong that we came to that conclusion. It just means you need to take a few more steps to get there.
Exactly right. And, I would also clarify that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that that the doctrine of the immortality of the soul is unbiblical. I'm not saying
Mm-hmm.
that it contradicts the Bible by any means. Of course not, because how then could I maintain that it's true? What I'm saying is that it's not named, as you said, in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the terminology that the Bible uses to speak of, the anthropological teaching around the destiny of the human person.
Right. Yeah, sounds good to me. And yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add. I think we're ready to go on to the next slide.
Okay, yeah, and obviously we could have a whole session on the immortality of the soul, but we must move on to other matters. So I would, in light of these semantic distinctions that we've made, I would argue that what is really at issue is not whether immortality in the biblical sense is conditional, but whether all human persons in fact exist endlessly, or contrary-wise, some human beings in fact cease to exist. And note that for some conditionalists, physical death entails temporary cessation of existence, while eschatological death entails permanent cessation of existence. So some conditionalists would say that between death and resurrection, the person actually ceases to exist. So, but the bottom line is that the issue here is about existence as opposed to what we might call life or immortality, because life and immortality in the biblical sense are not value neutral terms like existence. And I think we need to also make a couple of important caveats here on Catholic anthropology, because obviously as Catholics, we do maintain the first of these two views, that all human persons in fact exist endlessly. But this does not mean that Catholic anthropology regards the body as a mere container, or worse, a prison for the soul, from which we happily escape at death. Secondly, the Catholic teaching does not regard endless existence as a necessary property of human nature. So it's not as though we say that by being human, necessarily we must exist forever, because that would, I think, raise us above the level of a creature, arguably. But what the Catholic theological anthropology underpinning the first view does do is it regards embodiment as good and necessary for the fullness of human life. And therefore, yes, resurrection is our hope, because resurrection is how the dead become embodied for all eternity. And secondly, it regards human persons as existing endlessly because God wills this. So it's not a necessary property of human nature. It is something that God wills for human beings whom he has created. And therefore, you could say, in a sense, we are conditionalists, because we don't say that humans exist perpetually, just completely unconditionally, like it had to be this way. We believe that humans exist perpetually because God granted that to humans. Now, this is another topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but won't. But I just wanted to mention that there are quite a number of biblical texts that imply that humans continue to exist after bodily death. And some of them are just cited there on the slide. I won't go through them. And if humans continue to exist after bodily death, then that obviously raises anthropological questions that, as you said earlier, will put us on a path towards some kind of a doctrine of the immortality of the soul, because the body dies and decays into nothingness. And if humans continue to exist while that is going on, then there must be something more to a human person than a body. However, the Bible does not give any detailed account of the intermediate state. Basically, all of the passages that I mentioned there on the slide are kind of allusions to some kind of an intermediate state, but not going into theological detail and making theological propositions about such a state. And we also don't really need to dwell on this, because our topic is what happens for all eternity to the unsaved, and not what happens between death and resurrection. So in moving on to Fudge's fourth chapter, he spends basically a chapter on the meaning of the Greek adjective aionios, which is usually translated eternal or everlasting in the New Testament. For example, in a passage pertinent to our topic, Matthew 25, verse 41 and 46, it is used in the terms eternal fire and eternal punishment. Now, Fudge argues that the word aionios can describe either character, that is quality, or duration, that is quantity, or both. So it can mean unending, but it does not necessarily mean unending. It can also mean something like pertaining to the age to come. And Fudge observes in this regard that the term eternal sin in Mark 3:29 and eternal judgment in Hebrews 6:2 do not imply unending actions of sinning or judging, but an act with age to come and unending consequences. So you could say that eternal, when used as a translation of aionios, is kind of like an antonym, an opposite of the term this worldly. So it's not this worldly, it's pertaining to the world to come. And on that basis, Fudge argues that eternal fire and eternal punishment refer to fire and punishment of the age to come that has permanent consequences, and not to fire that lasts forever, that never ends, or punishment that is actively ongoing forever. Now, I would say Fudge's argument at this point is quite reasonable. Word meaning, as we know, is context dependent, and it is not semantically necessary that the term eternal fire must mean fire that continues endlessly. It will depend on the context. So I think to some extent it's point taken. I think Fudge has some merit in his argument at this point. However, I think perhaps, while granting that Fudge's book is a biblical and historical study more than a theological study, perhaps he could have given a bit more attention to questions of philosophy of time. The question, I'm not by any means well versed in the philosophy of time myself, and so I'm not going to go down that road, but I would just pose the question, is it safe to assume that the age to come is an endless interval of time just as we currently experience it? Is that a safe assumption to make? What if the age to come is a state that is in some sense beyond time, in which the passage of time, or at least the perception of the passage of time, is fundamentally different than how we experience it in this life? So, that kind of opens a can of worms, but it's something that has major implications for our topic. And I think Fudge's book kind of passes over it in silence, which makes it seem to me as though he's simply making an assumption about the philosophy of time and about the nature of the age to come in terms of time, that it's just more time as we currently experience it, a lot more time as we currently experience it, that goes on and on and on without end. Okay, that's chapter 4. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, not really. I mean, like what you said, it's quite, I think his argument's quite reasonable. He's just showing here's a plausible and consistent alternate interpretation. And I think that, that's one way that you can certainly read the text. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
well,
obviously we'll have to wait until we get into the New Testament in the next episode to see whether, contextually speaking, that interpretation really has merits.
yeah. And then your comment on the philosophy of time, I think, is interesting. But obviously, I think that, um, that you do note that it has major implications for our topic, but maybe we can just continue with his assumption, I suppose, on the interval view of time.
Yeah, I think if you want to discuss the philosophy of time with someone, it really shouldn't be me.
Mm-hmm.
So in chapter 5, Fudge looks at the biblical depiction of the state of the dead, particularly through the lens of the Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word, Hades. So concerning Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, Fudge denies that it is an exclusive place of punishment for the wicked, and he also doubts that the dead in Sheol have any real existence. Now, by contrast, the biblical scholar Philip Johnston points out that the term Sheol is almost exclusively reserved for those under divine judgment, whether the wicked, the afflicted righteous, or all sinners. And furthermore, most biblical scholars of the Hebrew Bible that I've read would characterize Sheol in the Hebrew Bible as a place of, as Bernstein puts it, pale half existence rather than non-existence. So you could say that Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, those that are in Sheol are not really alive. Remember, we said that life in the Bible is not a value neutral term like existence. It is a state of blessedness and happiness in the presence of God. So, those that are in Sheol in Hebrew Bible terms, you wouldn't really say that they're alive, but that doesn't mean that they are completely non-existent. The texts that speak of Sheol do not also suggest that there's no existence at all there. Moving on to chapters 6 to 8, which I'm kind of condensing here. In these chapters, Fudge seeks to answer the question, what data does the Old Testament contain about the end of the wicked? And as we noted earlier, by Old Testament, he of course means Protestant Old Testament. And his summary, after going through a lot of texts over 3 chapters, his summary is that, quote, the godless will come to nothing. They will perish, will disappear, will not be found. Their place will be empty. They will no longer exist, end quote. In contrast, he says, the Old Testament passages surveyed, quote, say nothing of conscious unending torment. They do not envision the presence of the wicked forever, unquote. Now, I must say that I pretty much completely agree with Fudge's exegesis of the text. I haven't even mentioned the text that he cites because there's a lot of them, and because I agree with his exegesis in any case, it's not really necessary to go into them. But I will add a very important qualifier. I agree with Fudge's exegesis of these texts at the grammatical historical level. And that is a very important qualifier because as Christians, we cannot limit ourselves to the grammatical historical meaning of the Old Testament. To do so would be fatal to Christian faith because it's not what the New Testament does when it interprets the Old Testament. So, in fact, if you look at the broader subject of afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, as opposed to just divine judgment in the Hebrew Bible, most scholars would agree that the Hebrew Bible has little to say about any sort of afterlife, including resurrection, which of course we know is a central idea to Christianity and to the New Testament. So to quote one scholar, Mark T. Finney, he says, quote, "Hell as a place of eternal suffering and punishment does not exist in the Hebrew Bible. Early Israelite thought on death simply assumed that it marked, for all people, the end of worthwhile existence," unquote. Note that important adjective there, the end of worthwhile existence, not the end of existence. But nonetheless, the point here is that there is no place of eternal suffering and punishment mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. I'll readily concede that with Finney. And early Israelite thought basically was that death is the end of worthwhile existence. But that was not just for the wicked, but also for the righteous. So the Hebrew Bible really has very little to say about any afterlife at all, including for the righteous. And it was really during the Second Temple period, influenced by horrific this worldly experiences, for instance, the persecutions by the Greeks that led to the Maccabean revolt, an apocalyptic eschatological worldview developed in some Jewish circles that included an expectation of resurrection. And these apocalyptically minded Jews, in which we could include early Christians within that grouping of apocalyptically minded Jews, they did not limit themselves to the grammatical historical meaning of Scripture. So to give a couple of examples, in Exodus 3, verse 6, we read, "He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And in Psalm 16, verse 10, we read, "For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit." Now, at the grammatical historical level, I think pretty much any biblical scholar would agree that neither of these texts has anything to do with resurrection. But both of these texts are quoted or used as proof texts for resurrection in the New Testament. As we know, Exodus 3, verse 6 is used by Jesus in his argument with the Sadducees, which appears in all three synoptic gospels, Mark chapter 12, for example. And Psalm 16:10 is quoted by Peter in his sermon in Acts chapter 2 as a proof text for the resurrection of Jesus. So both of these texts are used in the New Testament as proofs of resurrection, yet neither one of them is about resurrection at the grammatical historical level, meaning that the Hebrew author of Exodus, the Hebrew author of Psalm 16, did not have resurrection in mind when he was writing those words. And that basically means that if we look at texts about the judgment of the wicked, the punishment of the wicked, and so on in the Hebrew Bible, and we don't find anything about eschatological punishment and eternal conscious torment, for example, that is a grammatical historical interpretation, but it does not rule out that apocalyptically minded Jews and indeed early Christians could have read those texts through an apocalyptic lens and come to see them as teaching something that goes beyond the grammatical historical meaning that we could refer to as a sensus plenior, a fuller sense of the text. So we should allow at least the possibility that apocalyptic Judaism assigned new eschatological meaning to texts about the fate of the wicked. And with that possibility in mind, I'd like us to look at just two key texts in the Hebrew Bible. The first one is Isaiah 66, 23 and 24, which are actually the last two verses of the book of Isaiah. And I read from the NRSV, "From new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. And they shall go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." Unquote. So Fudge does discuss this passage, of course, and he says that this passage contains not one hint of conscious torment. Instead, he says it is a simple narrative providing, quote, "a final view of dead bodies being consumed by maggots and by fire until nothing finally remains." He further opines that this fire, quote, "eventually goes out when it has consumed all its fuel," unquote. So this is actually a passage that where I disagree with Fudge already at the grammatical historical level, but we'll also need to look at the reception history of this text after we look at its grammatical historical meaning. So I found that there are two major problems with Fudge's reading. Firstly, he underestimates the degree to which it anticipates later ideas about hell. Okay, this may be a point more about the reception history than the grammatical historical meaning. But nevertheless, the text does not say that the fire goes out. That is an inference by Fudge, but the text does not say so. It implies that the maggots and the fire continue week after week and month after month. As Bernstein puts it, Trito Isaiah, that is the portion of Isaiah where Isaiah 66 occurs, transfers the interminability of the reward to the punishment when he imagines another fire, one that would not end. So in Bernstein's view, this passage envisions a fire that doesn't end. And most biblical commentators on Isaiah would identify the setting of Isaiah 66:24 as the Valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem. And this is, of course, the place from which the Greek term Gehenna derives, which is, as we'll see, the normative term for hell in the New Testament, the place of eschatological punishment. So really, the only ingredient that is missing in this text for this to be a picture of eternal conscious torment is consciousness, because there's no hint that the individuals, the corpses that are described are actually conscious. So we don't have eternal conscious torment at the grammatical historical level, but we have what seems to be a fire that never ends, located in the place that would come to, or that would lend its name to, Gehenna. So I think it is the case that Fudge has underestimated the importance of this text for the development of ideas about hell. So I don't think Fudge shows enough concern with the reception of this text in apocalyptic Judaism and early Christianity. And this is where I'm going to bring in Judith that we referred to earlier. And of course, again, this is a canonical biblical text for Catholics, but not for Protestants. Judith actually paraphrases this text from Isaiah as referring to unending suffering. It's in Judith 16:17, also at the end of the book. It says, "Woe to the nations that rise up against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in the day of judgment. He will send fire and worms into their flesh. They shall weep in pain forever." So that's a pretty clear statement of eternal conscious torment, I would say. And it's pretty clear also that this text is dependent on Isaiah 66:24 for its imagery of fire and worms. And then moving on to the New Testament, to a text that Protestants would also accept as canonical from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, the end of verse 47 through verse 48. It says, "It is better for you to enter one-eyed into the kingdom of God than having two eyes to be thrown into Gehenna, where, quote, their worm does not die and the fire is not extinguished," end quote. And then end the bigger quote. That, by the way, was my translation of that verse. So it's clear that Mark, Jesus in Mark, is quoting Isaiah 66:24 and saying that that language taken from Isaiah is actually a reference to the punishment of Gehenna. So the eschatological punishment. So again, that, Mark, that particular text in Mark is not necessarily or not explicitly speaking of eternal conscious torment, but it is taking Isaiah 66:24 and positioning it or locating that text in Gehenna. The events that are described in that text are located in Gehenna. So that's Isaiah 66:24. Before we go on to our second text, I don't know if you have any comments. That was a bit of a long discussion of that text.
I'm interested in this point about you know, right here in this first bullet point, Fudge shows too much concern with the grammatical historical meaning of this text and too little concern with its reception in apocalyptic Judaism and early Christianity. I was wondering if you could flesh out a bit more on, I mean, you made one point about how simply being concerned with the grammatical historical reading would be bad, right, for Christian theology, because then you could say that a lot of times the New Testament authors were just engaging in eisegesis or reading things that were not in the original historical intent or purview of the author when they cite from Israel scriptures. So I was wondering if you could maybe, you know, touch on. I mean, I think the New Testament here is going to be particularly relevant, I think, for a Protestant reader, since they don't agree on the canonicity of Judith. But yeah, can you talk more about how this point is working in your argument?
Okay. Look, I think this is an instance of a broader hermeneutical point or hermeneutical observation.
Mm-hmm.
If we go outside of the topic of eschatology, you can take a famous example is in Matthew 2, where Matthew quotes from Hosea 11:1, where it says, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." And Matthew interprets that as a prophecy about the flight into Egypt, right, of the Holy Family.
Mm.
But it's pretty clear in Hosea that, you know, he's not prophesying about a particular child coming out of Egypt after going there on an extended journey. He's referring to the people of Israel as his son.
Mm-hmm.
And they came out of Egypt at the Exodus, right? So that's just a very clear example that I think everyone would concede that the New Testament writer is engaging in a kind of mystical interpretation. And if we say, no, the only thing we can do is read the grammatical historical meaning of the text, anything beyond that is just speculation and unwarranted, then as a Christian, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you would then have to concede that what Matthew is doing in Matthew chapter 2 with Hosea 11:1 is an unwarranted form of eisegesis.
Mm-hmm. So
if you then say, no, what Matthew is doing was valid, then you also need to allow space for texts, New Testament writers, when they're using the Old Testament texts about eschatological punishment, to also be doing something more than simply taking over the grammatical historical meaning of the text. So, and I think we can see an example of that in Judith, what we just quoted. Again, that's not the New Testament, but it is a writer who is working with Isaiah 66:24 and reimagining what the language is implying there, to mean that the corpses that are described there are actually conscious, weeping in pain forever. So, you know, I think it's a point that we also discussed in our previous episodes on the Trinity, because it also comes into play there. I mean, so many texts in the New Testament so many Old Testament texts are interpreted Christologically in the New Testament, right? And many of those texts, I think a lot of Christians don't even realize that, most biblical scholars do not regard those texts from the Hebrew Bible as messianic or Christological in their grammatical historical meaning. You can take texts as famous as like Psalm 110 verse 1. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Or Isaiah 53, about the suffering servant. Those, as Christians, we read those texts in the Old Testament and we automatically think of Jesus. It's like second nature to us.
Mm-hmm.
But biblical scholars, when they read those texts in the Hebrew Bible, there's much debate about who the referent is in many cases. But I would say the consensus is, say, in the case of Isaiah 53, there isn't really a consensus on who the suffering servant is, but there definitely is not a consensus that is a messianic text.
Yeah.
That even apart from Jesus of Nazareth, there's nothing like a consensus that the figure that's being referred to there is a personal individual Messiah that is coming. Right? So when we adopt and accept the New Testament as part of our scriptures, and therefore necessarily accept the New Testament's way of using the Old Testament, we basically, that comes with a lot of, the word baggage I think will be too negative here, but it comes with a lot of conditions attached that we then also have to adopt in terms of our way of reading the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really the point that I'm trying to make here, is that if we say, no, I'm going to read through all the Old Testament texts about punishment and limit myself to the grammatical historical meaning, well, that's great. You may go quite a long way to understanding what the ancient writers of the Hebrew Bible understood about punishment, but you're not going to go very far towards understanding what the early church understood about punishment.
Yeah, that checks out. And you have another Old Testament passage, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
The other one.
I'll save my other question for once you finish your Old Testament section, because I do have a question about your overarching take on the Old Testament on this issue.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So the other text is Daniel 12 verse 2, and it reads, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Now, this is the only text in the Hebrew Bible that unambiguously speaks of personal resurrection in its grammatical historical sense already. And I think quite a number of biblical scholars would say that this is actually the only text in the Hebrew Bible that unambiguously speaks of personal resurrection at all, or that speaks of personal resurrection at all. Full stop. Now, this text is ambiguous about what this post-resurrection shame and everlasting contempt might entail. It's interesting, though, to note that Isaiah 66:24 that we already discussed and Daniel 12:2 have the Hebrew Bible's only two occurrences of a rare word, direon, which means abhorrence, or contempt, as it's translated in Daniel 12:2, and in Isaiah 66:24 it's translated abhorrence. So if you're familiar with the Jewish rule of exegesis called gezerah shavah, it is a principle that if there's a common bit of terminology between two passages, then they can be interpreted together. So I think it's very likely that ancient Jewish exegetes would have read Isaiah 66:24 and Daniel 12:2 together because of this joint occurrence of this rare noun. And read together, the two texts, using only their grammatical historical sense, imply some kind of post-resurrection unending punishment. So from the unending part we get from from Isaiah, but perhaps also from the word everlasting in Daniel, and the post-resurrection part we get from Daniel. We don't have necessarily a conscious component to the punishment in either text. There's a possibility, again, depending what this shame and everlasting contempt actually means. We could have consciousness, but it's certainly by no means clear that we have consciousness here. I'll just mention, though, that most scholars think Daniel, in its final Hebrew Bible form, that is without the Greek portions, was written in the 2nd century before Christ. So it's basically the last book of the Hebrew Bible to be written. And so its ideas about the afterlife are more developed and later than the rest of the Hebrew Bible because it was written later. And that is why we do find an unambiguous reference to personal resurrection at the end of Daniel, which we don't find anywhere else in the Old Testament. So I think these two texts are two of the more important, in the sense that they start to move us towards what we'll see in apocalyptic Judaism of the intertestamental period and the later Second Temple period, and in the New Testament itself, in terms of teaching on eschatological punishment. Yeah, that's basically it for the Old Testament. So over to you, Suan.
You use the language of develop, and I was going to ask you if you think that the Hebrew Bible has one vision of what the afterlife, or at least the eschaton, is going to be like, or do you think that there are kind of multiple visions in the Hebrew Bible? But I think you would want to kind of maybe umbrella that under the term development. I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on the number of options in the Hebrew Bible on this question.
I would say that there's definitely development that occurs diachronically, chronologically, as we go to later books, like we've just seen in Daniel. We find something in Daniel that most scholars would agree we don't find anywhere else in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, that is, which is personal resurrection explicitly described. So there is, I think, a trajectory. I don't necessarily think it's a clear linear trajectory, but there is a development of ideas within the period in which the books of the Hebrew Bible were written, which is, at least a few hundred years of time. Whether I wouldn't say there are. I mean, every book, every author is going to have a slightly different picture or image of life and death and reward and punishment that they would present. But apart from Daniel 12, again, I would side with those scholars who say there isn't really a clear reference to personal resurrection or indeed an afterlife other than the half existence of Sheol anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, you have exceptional individuals like Enoch and Elijah, but that is not the norm of what happens to people after they die. But again, we have to keep in mind this distinction when we talk about what does the Hebrew Bible teach. Well, it's like, what do you mean? Do you mean the authorial intent? Do you mean the grammatical historical meaning? Or are you allowing for a sensus plenior? Are you allowing that there's inspiration, that there is that God is actually the ultimate author of these texts, and that he may be communicating something through these texts that the human writers themselves and people in their time did not fully appreciate, but would be appreciated later with the help of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I can say about that, but I think that's a good point that you made right there. All right, I'm ready to move on.
All right. So the rest of this episode, and I'm just having a look at time. Because I think we've been going for quite a while. I think I'll try and go a little bit quicker as we move through the Second Temple Jewish literature, although there are some important observations I'd like to make here as well. So Fudge spends 2 chapters surveying Second Temple Jewish literature, and his aim in these chapters is basically to counter the idea that ECT was the uniform Jewish view in Jesus' day, such that we can assume a priori that this was Jesus' view. And I think he is successful in this regard. He successfully makes the argument that there is diversity in Second Temple Jewish literature on the point of what is the final destiny of the wicked. Second Temple Jewish literature is known to be highly diverse in its theology and eschatology. So I think, again, it's point taken, and those that maybe he's responding to, who in promoting ECT have made the argument that no, this was just the prevailing view at the time of Jesus, and therefore, without even making much of a positive argument, we should assume, unless proven otherwise, that Jesus believed in ECT. I don't think that argument holds water. It's not true to the evidence of Second Temple Judaism. However, I found curiously that Fudge's overall approach in these chapters seems almost to be to rule the Second Temple Jewish literature evidence inadmissible as evidence due to its diversity. And I'm kind of deliberately using a kind of a legal terminology here, noting again that Fudge was a lawyer. Maybe he's approaching it in those terms that he almost wants to get Second Temple Jewish literature off the table as a piece of evidence and say it's inadmissible because people have been using it to prove that there's a uniform Jewish view, which is eternal conscious torment, and that's not the case, and therefore we can kind of brush the whole body of evidence aside and move on to what really matters, which is the New Testament. Now, obviously, the New Testament is canonical and authoritative, and Second Temple Jewish literature, other Second Temple Jewish literature isn't, with the exception, of course, of the Second Temple Jewish literature that forms part of the Catholic Bible. And, you know, even some of the books in the Protestant Bible were written in the Second Temple period, of course. But, you know, I think it's problematic that he seems to be happy to kind of explain away the evidence of Second Temple Jewish literature, rather than the way that I regard this literature is that it is a treasure trove of contextual data for interpreting the New Testament. So it provides us with a lot of language, a lot of ideas, developments in the history of ideas that arguably we then see reflected or taken further or developed differently, let's say, in the New Testament. And so to kind of push it off the table because we've successfully made our point that Second Temple Jewish literature does not uniformly teach ECT, I think we're kind of missing the point. So I would say, you know, anyone who reads his book can decide for themselves whether I'm being fair in saying this, but I would say that Fudge pays lip service to the idea that Second Temple Jewish literature is valuable contextual data, but he does not really apply it. You don't really find him much when he's interpreting the New Testament, referring back to some of the most relevant Second Temple Jewish texts to establish the context, the conceptual context of what the New Testament writer might be saying. I would also say that Fudge's level of engagement with Second Temple Jewish texts, I was disappointed in it because he generally doesn't engage with secondary literature. He just quotes from English translations of Second Temple Jewish literature and then interprets himself what he thinks the texts mean, but without engaging what experts on these texts think that they mean, which I think is a mistake. Okay, so coming back to Judith, we quoted it earlier, so I won't quote it again, but I just, on the point of its canonicity, I just want to mention as an aside that the Book of 1 Clement, which is generally regarded as having been written near the end of the 1st century AD, in chapter 55, 4 and 5, it cites Judith, and this is within an extended reminder about what the writer calls the sacred scriptures, the sayings of God. That was how they were referred to in chapter 53, verse 1. So it appears that we have a 1st century Christian writer regarding Judith as sacred scripture. And I think that that should be taken into account when thinking about the canonicity of Judith, both for ourselves and also for what the early Christians thought, who, if, for example, the author of 1 Clement regarded Judith as canonical, as scripture, and that author presumably had read Judith 16, verse 17, which we already quoted, and if he followed the same interpretation of that text as both Fudge and I take, which is that it teaches eternal conscious torment, then we would have to conclude that there is a 1st century Christian writer who would also take that view of eternal conscious torment. You might say that's a little bit speculative, but I think it is a reasonable inference, I think. Now, interestingly, when Fudge discusses this text, Judith 16, 17, as I mentioned before, he acknowledges that it teaches ECT, but he adopts a polemical tone towards this ancient text. And what he says is this, Judith is not drawing on Isaiah's conviction. She is denying it. She is not following Isaiah. She is reversing Isaiah. I would maybe put a sick on the pronoun she that he uses there, because I don't think the general view is that Judith is the author of the book of Judith. She's the main character of the book of Judith. It's possible that it was written by a woman, but given what we know of patriarchal society in the ancient world, it's pretty unlikely. But anyway, that's a side issue. He's taking a polemical tone towards the ancient text that he's surveying. And I mean, regardless whether you think that it's canonical or not, if your purpose is just to survey what different writers in the ancient world thought on the subject of punishment, I don't really think it's necessary to take a polemical stance towards a writer that you disagree with. It's not at least something that one would typically come across in biblical scholarship, I think. But in any case, if we move on to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Fudge only discusses Dead Sea Scrolls texts that were available to him at the time of his first edition, which was published in 1982. And, there were a lot of Dead Sea Scrolls that had not been published, were not available to scholars by 1982. So in the 3rd edition of his book, Fudge states in a footnote that he had read, and this is published in 2011, mind you, he states in a footnote that he had read an English translation of the entire Dead Sea Scrolls, and acknowledging some ambiguities, his original opinion remains. And that is, quote, "So far as the authors of these ancient scrolls give any indication, the community whose views they record anticipated a day when the wicked would be thoroughly destroyed and be no more," unquote. Now, most Dead Sea Scrolls scholars now acknowledge significant theological diversity, both diachronic and synchronic, that is, both over time and at a given point in time within the Qumran literature itself. So we can't really speak of a single view, even of the Qumran community on theological topics. So with that said, there are definitely texts that seem to indicate annihilation, and Fudge quotes some of these. Sometimes the annihilation seems to occur after a long period of suffering, but it is still the ultimate end of the wicked. But I would say there are other texts that seem to indicate unending suffering. My translation here will be taken from the Dead Sea Scrolls Reader, and this is a quotation from the Treatise of the Two Spirits, which is a section within the Community Rule 1QS. Chapter 4, verses 12 to 14, it reads, "The judgment of all who walk in such ways will be multiple afflictions at the hands of all the angels of perdition, everlasting damnation in the wrath of God's furious vengeance, never-ending terror and reproach for all eternity, with a shameful extinction in the fire of hell's outer darkness. For all their errors, generation by generation, they will know doleful sorrow, bitter evil, and dark happenstance until their utter destruction with neither remnant nor rescue." So you could say it kind of sounds like this punishment that's described here will eventually end with annihilation, but it ends in annihilation after a long time, even described as for all eternity, generation by generation. So it's almost a bit ambiguous whether the punishment ends in annihilation or not. But what is very clear is that it's not merely execution as in, physical death. It is a punishment of a transcendent nature. And then another quotation from the Community Rule, the main portion of the text, not the subtext of the Treatise of the Two Spirits. And this reads, chapter 2, verses 7 to 9, "May you be damned without mercy in return for your dark deeds, an object of wrath, licked by eternal flame, surrounded by utter darkness. May God have no mercy upon you when you cry out, nor forgive so as to atone for your sins. May he lift up his furious countenance upon you for vengeance. May you never find peace through the appeal of any intercessor." So again, you could say it's ambiguous, but I would say it's certainly open to the possibility that this is describing a punishment that doesn't end. I would note, though, that the translations that I've just quoted, which is a recent scholarly English translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls Reader, these translations are markedly different from the ones quoted in Fudge's book. But Fudge's translations are from Geza Vermes's 1961 edition, and this is in the very early days. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were only discovered in the 1940s. So this is like at the dawn of scholarly inquiry into the scrolls. And Vermes's translation was actually a translation of a translation. So he translated a French translation of the Hebrew into English. So it's actually an indirect translation of the Hebrew. And I think for that reason alone, it shouldn't be one's first option as a translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'm not going to delve too far into the exegesis of these two texts, the ins and outs of the word meanings and so on, and whether it does in fact imply ECT, but it's just some food for thought. Now, turning from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the pseudepigrapha, Fudge surveys 12 pseudepigraphic texts, which he classifies as follows. There are a few that he says are unambiguously annihilationist, which are the Sibylline Oracles, books 3 and 4, the Damascus document. I've put sick there because the Damascus document is actually a Qumran text, a Dead Sea Scrolls text, although it was discovered before the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Psalms of Solomon and for Ezra. Under the category of ambiguous, he puts Assumption of Moses, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and Life of Adam and Eve. Under the rubric of mixed testimony, he puts the Book of Jubilees, 1 Enoch and 2 Baruch. And unambiguously ECT, he puts there 2 Enoch and 4 Maccabees. Now, I would note again, in terms of the scholarly quality of Fudge's work in these chapters, all of his quotations from the pseudepigrapha are from R.H. Charles's work published in 1913, although the well-known volumes, Old Testament pseudepigrapha, those were published, I think, in 1985, which granted was after his first edition, but it was between his first and second edition. So one might have expected him to update the quotations to recent ones. I'm not going to look at obviously all of those texts. That will take us forever, but I'm just going to take a closer look at 2 of the above sources, which are 1 Enoch and 4 Ezra. Just note that 1 Enoch he classifies as having mixed testimony, which I would agree with, and 4 Ezra he calls unambiguously annihilationist, which I would not agree with. So let's go a bit more into detail on those 2 texts, and that will lead us to the end of the episode, I think, except for any further discussion that might be required. So 1 Enoch, as it's known, is a composite work consisting of 5 major parts with distinct origins and dates, ranging from the 3rd century before Christ, for instance, the Book of the Watchers, which is chapters 1 to 36, to around the turn of the era, meaning around, AD, beginning where BC changed to AD, around the time of the birth of Christ, in other words. The Book of Parables is generally regarded to be the last part of the Book of Enoch to be written. And this is a very important source of background information on the Jewish apocalyptic milieu from which the Jesus movement emerged. So it is very important as contextual data for the New Testament. Fudge's assessment that 1 Enoch contains both annihilationist and ECT traditions is accurate. He adduces 3 passages as teaching ECT, which are chapter 27, 1 to 3, chapter 67, 4 to 13, and chapter 108, 3 to 6. But interestingly, his comments suggest that he finds these texts also ambiguous. So he doesn't really fully concede that that 1 Enoch contains ECT traditions. Fudge relies solely on R.H. Charles' 1917 translation, although there were more recent translations available to him both before and soon after the first edition of The Fire That Consumes. The translations that I will be using here are taken from Nicolsburg's 2-volume commentary on 1 Enoch from the Hermeneia series. So starting with the Book of the Watchers, what Nicolsburg says in his commentary is that 1 Enoch's religious thought lacks consistency and defies systematization, end quote, which is particularly evident in the corpus's statements about the Great Judgment. So we should bear that caveat in mind, that we shouldn't expect to find clear consistency in the religious thought in this book. Remembering again that it is a composite work written over a long period of time. The Book of the Watchers speaks of the confinement of angels and or human spirits until the great day of judgment or forever. So there is a clear intermediate state in the Book of the Watchers, and it's not always completely clear whether language refers to the intermediate state or the final state, both in the case of the righteous and the wicked. In chapters 23, verse 1 to 24, 1, Enoch is shown a fire that ran and did not rest or quit its course day and night. In chapter 27, 1-3, Enoch sees a place called this cursed valley, which will be the habitation of the cursed for all time. And scholars have identified this valley as the Valley of Hinnom, which, as we said earlier, gave its name to Gehenna, as we find that term in the New Testament. A section of 1 Enoch called the Animal Apocalypse, in chapter 90, there's an allegorical vision that describes stars, shepherds, and sheep being thrown into an abyss and burned. Now, bearing in mind that since this is allegorical, we should not necessarily take the being burned up literally. Coming to the Epistle of Enoch, in chapter 99 of the book, we have ambiguous language, like it says the wicked, quote, will be brought to an end, unquote, but also the wicked, quote, will have no peace, unquote, and quote, will have no rest, unquote. That's in chapter 99, 11-16. But there is one passage that compels caution about rushing to conclude that language that sounds like annihilation entails annihilation. So in chapter 102, verses 4, 6, and 10-11, we read, "Fear not, souls of the righteous. Take courage, you pious who have died. When you die, then the sinners say about you, look then, those who consider themselves righteous, of what sort their destruction has been. No righteousness was found in them until they died. And they perished and became as those who are not, and their souls descended with pain into Sheol." So this last sentence is about the wicked who consider themselves righteous. And you see that it says they perished and became as those who are not. So that part of the verse sounds like annihilation, but then it goes on and said, and their souls descended with pain into Sheol. So it appears like the first part is maybe describing a bodily punishment, that their bodies perished and became non-existent, but their souls then descended with pain into Sheol. So if we read a passage, including in the New Testament, say, that speaks of perishing, we shouldn't necessarily assume on those grounds alone that entails annihilation or end of existence, because we can see from other literature of the period that that's not necessarily the case. And then in chapter 103, and note that this is not one of the passages Fudge quoted as teaching ECT in the book of Enoch. It says, "Woe to you, dead sinners! Know that down to Sheol they will lead your souls, and there they will be in great distress, and in darkness and in a snare and in a flaming fire. Into great judgments your souls will enter, and the great judgment will be for all the generations of eternity. Woe to you, you will have no peace." So this sounds like ECT to me. And then in chapter 108, in what is called another book of Enoch, we again find language that sounds like annihilation that turns out not to be annihilation. So it says, "You who have observed it and are waiting in these days until the evildoers are brought to an end. For their names will be erased from the book of life, and their descendants will perish forever." So up until now, it kind of sounds like annihilation, but it continues. "Their spirits will be slaughtered, and they will cry out and groan in a desolate, unseen place, and in fire they will burn, for there is no earth there. And I asked one of the holy angels who were with me, what is this glorious place? For there is no heaven, but only flames of fire that are burning, and the sound of weeping and crying and groaning and severe pain. And he, that is the angel, said to me, the place that you see, here are thrown the spirits of the sinners and blasphemers and those who do evil. And the righteous as they shine will see those who were born in darkness cast into darkness, and the sinners will cry out and see them shining, and they for their part will depart to where the days and times are written for them." So again, there's language that sounds like annihilation, but it then appears that it's not annihilation. The last part of the book of Enoch that we'll look at is the book of Parables. It's not the last part in terms of chapters of the book, but the last part that was written according to scholars. Fudge construes the book of Parables as teaching annihilation, and he calls this book particularly relevant to New Testament doctrine, which is interesting. So he does acknowledge the relevance of this portion of 1 Enoch as context for interpreting the New Testament. So Nicolsburg, in his commentary, avers that the book lacks uniformity on the subject of final punishment, meaning the book of Parables itself, not just the whole of 1 Enoch. Given that those who are referred to as the kings and the mighty will be driven or perish from the earth, but then there are other statements that they will be punished in a deep valley at earth's perimeter. So there is ambiguity throughout chapters 38 to 54, where we find language about sinners being driven away, perishing, destroyed, filled with shame, etc. 1 Enoch 53:5 speaks of instruments being prepared for the kings and the mighty of this earth, that they may perish thereby. So again, the word perish, at first glance, okay, it sounds annihilationist maybe, but the instruments that are being prepared turn out to be great iron chains. And, chains are generally used for confinement and not for execution. So perhaps this suggests that what is meant by perishing is not the end of existence. In chapters 62 and 63, the Lord of Spirits seats the Son of Man upon the throne of his glory. Obviously, this is language that will immediately call to mind some passages from the Synoptic Gospels. And the Son of Man, the text then goes on to say, here's an extended quote from 1 Enoch 62 and 63 with a few ellipses. The Son of Man will press the kings and the mighty, and he will deliver them to the angels for punishment. In those days, the mighty and the kings who possess the land will implore the angels of his punishment to give them a little respite. And they will say, would that we might be given respite, that we might glorify and praise and make confession in the presence of your glory. Now we desire a little respite and do not find it. We pursue it and do not lay hold of it. And light has vanished from our presence, and darkness is our dwelling forever and ever. Now they will say to themselves, our lives are full of ill-gotten wealth, but it does not prevent us from descending into the flame of the torment of Sheol. And after that, their faces will be filled with darkness and shame in the presence of that Son of Man, and from his presence they will be driven, and a sword will abide before him in their midst. So here we find this picture of these mighty and the kings who are in a place of punishment, being punished by the angels, and they actually plead for some relief. And the implication of the text is that their request for relief is denied. And so it sounds like unending punishment, because they explicitly ask for the punishment to end, and the request is not granted. So on those grounds, I would disagree with Fudge that in his contention that the book of Parables is purely annihilationist. Okay, I'll come up for air at this point, because that's all that I wanted to say on 1 Enoch. I don't know if you have any comments or questions on that.
Two things really quick. Do you remember which passage from the Psalms of Solomon he says sounds annihilationist?
I don't offhand,
That's
unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, because that's a text that I worked on this semester and came to quite love. So it'd be just nice to know what the citation is on that at some point. And then with the with Enoch, there are times in which Enoch will say, I forget where it is. I overheard this from John J. Collins, but he said something like the sons of men, or excuse me, anyway, there's somebody, I think it's the angels, who say something like, or maybe it's the son of the angels, but they say like, or the watchers, they'll say, we'll live forever, but then it's only 400 years. And so there are these weird instances in which it'll say forever, but it only actually means what we would consider a finite time. And so I'm wondering if that factors into any of this at all in any relevant sense.
Yeah, it very much could. So I think it's probably a sword that cuts both ways, in the
Sure.
sense that someone who's reading these texts through annihilationist lenses might find some of this terminology about perishing and destruction and so on as, oh, that's clearly annihilationist. And then someone who is coming at it from an ECT standpoint might look at it and read terms like forever and assume that it's unending. And maybe both of those contentions are not the case. At least there's a degree of ambiguity there. And as I said before, there's also a certain amount of inconsistency and in a composite work that shows evidence of a lot of editing and editorial work and redaction to reach the form in which it survives.
Yep, that's all I had.
Okay, so the last Second Temple Jewish text outside of the New Testament itself, of course, that I'd like to look at is for Ezra. And this is a Jewish apocalypse from the late 1st century AD or CE, roughly contemporaneous with the canonical Gospels and the book of Revelation. So it's pretty, you can see that it's pretty significant just from the fact that it's a Jewish apocalypse written around the same time as the apocalypse that's in the New Testament canon. According to Fudge, it unambiguously teaches that the wicked will totally pass away. Fudge cites only one scholarly source, which is a Bible dictionary entry, although a major English language commentary on 4 Ezra had appeared before the second edition of The Fire That Consumes. So again, I think we can challenge Fudge a little bit in the quality of his scholarship into Second Temple Jewish literature, because granted that these are non-canonical texts, I still think one should give them the level of investigation that one might, or at least approaching the level of investigation that one might give canonical texts, because it's still important to interpret what these texts are saying and what their language means if we are going to accurately use this evidence as contextual background to the New Testament. So I think it leaves a little bit to be desired, the way that that Fudge treats these texts. So I'm going to take my translations of 4 Ezra from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, since it does form part of the apocryphal books in that translation. Fudge quotes 4 Ezra 7 verse 61 as self-evident proof of the book's annihilationism. And this text says, "I will not grieve over the great number of those who perish, for it is they who are now like a mist and are similar to a flame and smoke. They are set on fire and burn hotly and are extinguished." So this text is actually emphasizing the transience of the wicked in contrast to the righteous few. It is not even clear that it is talking about final punishment when it uses the simile of flames and smoke. And I would refer the interested listener to Stone's commentary in the Hermeneia series in what he says about this text. Fudge concedes that 4 Ezra anticipates that the wicked undergo torments after death while awaiting a final punishment. So there is a very clear intermediate state described in 4 Ezra. And that also indicates that the work is clearly anthropologically dualist and does not equate physical death with non-existence or even unconsciousness, because it has people experiencing degrees of reward and punishment in the intermediate state while awaiting the final judgment. The spirits of the wicked after death, for example, according to chapter 7, verse 80, immediately wander about in torments, always grieving and sad. And these griefs include that they shall consider the torment laid up for themselves in the last days. That's in 784, and that some of them will cross over into torments, 786. 787 uses characteristic annihilation language to describe something that precedes the final judgment, and therefore cannot be annihilation in the sense of a cessation of existence. It says, these souls, quote, shall utterly waste away in confusion and be consumed with shame, and shall wither with fear at seeing the glory of the Most High, in whose presence they are to be judged in the last times, end quote. So wasting away, being consumed, I mean, consumed is the word that Fudge used in the title of his book. That's how strong of a picture of annihilation he regards that word as conveying. And yet it is used here in a context where it clearly does not refer to annihilation. Elsewhere, the writer uses terms such as perish, death, destruction, and perdition, in the English translation, of course, all assumed by annihilationists to refer to annihilation in the New Testament for a fate that entails more than physical death. So, for an example, in chapter 8, verses 55 and 59, Ezra is told, therefore do not ask any more questions about the great number of those who perish, for just as the things that I have predicted await you, so the thirst and torment that are prepared await them. So perishing on the one hand and thirst and torment on the other. Stone in his commentary writes the following, with a couple of ellipses, quote, for Ezra uses the language of death in two major fashions. The first is of physical death. The second major use of this notion is more general, less precisely defined. In it, death appears as the equivalent of perdition or damnation, and in opposition not just to life, but to eternal life. In 831, death is simply the equivalent of eternal punishment, end quote. So Stone in his commentary gives credence to the idea that death in 4 Ezra, in one of the senses in which it is used, is a kind of eschatological death that is more or less equivalent to eternal punishment. And furthermore, concerning destruction and perdition in chapter 10, verse 10, Stone writes, quote, destruction here may go back to Greek apouleia and Hebrew abaddon, a technical term for the underworld, parallel to Sheol and Mawet in the Hebrew Bible. Note therefore the parallelism of corruption, ways of death, paths of perdition in 748. Consequently, the term perdition does not necessarily imply annihilation, but death, which is regarded in 4 Ezra either negatively or neutrally. So this scholar, who, as far as I know, doesn't have any theological axe to grind when he's writing this. I mean, he's writing a scholarly commentary on a non-canonical book, but he's specifically makes the point that the term perdition, which is a translation of the same word that is usually translated destruction in the New Testament, does not necessarily imply annihilation. The book does make mention of Gehenna, and it describes Gehenna as a place of fire and torments, but it does not explicitly refer to its duration. So that's an area of ambiguity. And that's why I would agree that it is, well, I'm not agreeing with Fudge, because Fudge says it's explicitly annihilationist. It's clearly annihilationist. I don't think that's the case, but I would concede that there is ambiguity. So in chapter 7, 36 to 38, It says, the pit of torment shall appear, and opposite shall be the place of rest, and the furnace of Gehenna shall be disclosed, and opposite it the paradise of delight. Then the Most High will say to the nations that have been raised from the dead, look now and understand whom you have denied, whom you have not served, whose commandments you have despised. Look on this side and on that. Here are delight and rest, and there are fire and torments. Thus he will speak to them on the day of judgment. And again in chapter 7, 66 to 67, the writer says, it is much better with cattle and flocks than with us, for they do not look for a judgment, and they do not know of any torment or salvation promised to them after death. What does it profit us that we shall be preserved alive but cruelly tormented? So there's clearly a picture of eschatological post-mortem torments and also post-resurrection fire and torments. What is not clear is whether this post-resurrection torment comes to an end and ends in annihilation. It's possible that it does, but it's also possible that it does not. But there's definitely a transcendent punishment after resurrection that entails fire and torment. So we know basically what we can say, I think with something approaching certainty, is that 4 Ezra envisions supernatural torment for the wicked between death and resurrection, as well as after the resurrection. But what we cannot clearly say is whether the post-resurrection torment is unending or ends with annihilation. That is it for Ezra, and I just have a couple of closing comments on Second Temple Jewish literature by way of summary, and then I'll end my presentation and hand back to you, Suan, for any further comments or questions. So I would say basically that Fudge is correct, that there are diverse views about the fate of the wicked in Second Temple Judaism, but I think he has underestimated the evidence for transcendent punishment, including ECT. And I think we've seen that in the book of Enoch, for example. And we also notice that some Second Temple Jewish texts use annihilation-esque terms like perish, destroy, die, and end in the context of statements about ECT. And this, to me, is an important insight that we must bear in mind when it comes to interpret such language in the New Testament. If such language does not necessarily connote annihilation in these texts, then the same should apply in the New Testament as well. So in other words, it's not an open and shut case when reading the New Testament to say, oh, it refers to perishing or destruction or death as the punishment of the wicked, and therefore it's annihilationism. The passages about transcendent punishment and ECT in Second Temple literature that we referred to contain some of the closest known parallels to Jesus' judgment sayings in the Synoptic Gospels. We have language about departing, weeping, fire, darkness, being thrown, cursed, punished with angels, etc., etc. So there's a lot of literary and linguistic parallels between the descriptions of ECT in 1 Enoch, for example, and the language that we find in the Synoptic Gospels in the teachings of Jesus. And I think that is important when it comes to interpreting some of these controverted texts or sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. Second Temple Jewish texts that presuppose ECT often do so while unmistakably drawing on major Old Testament judgment texts, such as Isaiah 66:24 and Daniel 12:2 that we looked at closely, as well as other texts like Sodom and Gomorrah, the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah. So this again shows us that there is a tendency in Second Temple Jewish literature, particularly in apocalyptic literature, to take texts from the Jewish scriptures that in their grammatical historical meaning, we agree do not refer to transcendent or eschatological punishment, taking those texts and applying them to transcendent eschatological punishment. And so if other Second Temple Jewish writers are doing that, then we should at least allow the possibility that the New Testament writers do as well. So again, returning to my earlier point, from what we've seen in the Old Testament, as well as what we've seen in Second Temple Jewish literature, we cannot come to the New Testament with an assumption that the writers only have the grammatical historical meaning in mind when they quote and allude to Old Testament texts. So that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah, it almost seems like that last bullet point might be like the perfect summarization of everything that you said so far. So just to kind of provide the audience with maybe a grand summary, right, to kind of help put it all together. On the one, I think what you're trying to say is like, look, we're building up to exegeting the New Testament and trying to figure out, the meaning of Jesus's words and the meaning of other kind of passages that talk about the afterlife. And what you're pointing out is that, look, even if you show that maybe there's this passage in the Old Testament that reads in such a way that might seem annihilationist, right, in its grammatical historical context, although I don't think you ever concede that for anything. You're just saying that even if it did read that way, one, that's not how it's received, and that's not how the New Testament necessarily will receive an Old Testament text in the grammatical historical sense. So even if he wins that battle, or if he wins that battle, he hasn't won the war, so to speak. The other thing that you're pointing out is that with a lot of these other ancient texts, you see that you have eternal conscious torment there. You might also have some annihilationist things, and you're kind of critiquing the impression that he's giving, or maybe some of his data points, right? But I think, as I see it, this is all building up to ultimately exegeting the New Testament and getting the best reading that we can. Is that a fair summarization of your case?
Yes, I think so, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is leading us towards the New Testament and what we're going to find there. And of course, hopefully helping us to interpret the New Testament texts accurately.
Right.
But coming back to your point about whether I would concede that Old Testament texts are annihilationist, I would say, to even pose the question whether they are annihilationist, except perhaps for a late text like Daniel 12:2,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's anachronistic, because as I said earlier, in the view of most biblical scholars, the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, except for a handful of passages,
Right.
doesn't really have anything to say about afterlife, and construes death to be the end of all meaningful or worthwhile existence.
Mm-hmm.
So if in that sense you could maybe say, okay, it's quasi-annihilationist, but it's not even working in an eschatological frame of reference. So as soon as if you accept that scholarly consensus, then are you going to then conclude that scholarly consensus supports annihilationism? I would say that saying so does not make any more sense than to say that the scholarly consensus supports the Sadducean view on the resurrection, that there is no resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the Hebrew Bible, read grammatically historically, could be construed as supporting a Sadducean view of the resurrection, that there is no resurrection, because at the grammatical historical level, the Hebrew Bible has very little to say about resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that the Sadducees, I don't know how the Sadducees were interpreting the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. I think some scholars believe they only read the Pentateuch. But whatever the case is, they were not they kind of ruled out eschatology in general. You know, we know from Acts 23 that they didn't believe in angels either. So there were a lot of sort of the whole transcendent world, you might say, was not part of their worldview. And yeah, maybe I'm going off point a bit, but the point is, if you prove that based on grammatical historical meanings of Old Testament texts that there's no eternal conscious torment for the wicked, you will prove by the very same argument basically that there's no resurrection and no eternal life. So, you know, it's not really a tenable line of argument, I think, for Christians.
I'll just say one last thing.
Accept the New Testament.
Yeah. I'll just say one last thing, and then we can close out the episode. I think that this is a way in which I think Fudge's Protestantism comes out, because I've noticed that for a lot of Protestants who do biblical theology, they have this confidence that if you do the historical grammatical method or reading, that you'll just still end up with Christian orthodoxy. And it's like, wait, no, it's a bit more complicated when you start kind of peeling back an ecclesial hermeneutic, right? And you just try to do it on your own with the historical documents and sources. It's more complicated than that. You might. So that's all I'll say there. I don't know if you agree with that, Thomas, but I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think maybe when some Christians are taking that approach, they are either unknowingly moving beyond a grammatical historical interpretation of Old Testament texts. Like pretty much any time that you interpret an Old Testament text messianically, you are moving beyond the grammatical historical meaning, whether you're aware of it or not. We spoke about Isaiah 53 and Psalm 110 earlier, just as two examples. So you are moving beyond. If you're a Christian and you interpret those texts messianically as referring to Christ, you are moving beyond a grammatical historical interpretation of the Old Testament. So why only do that for messianic texts and not when it comes to eschatology? So I think we just have to be consistent in our hermeneutic. If we're really going to be rigidly consistent in applying only grammatical historical interpretation of the Old Testament, then I would almost have to say we have to reject the New Testament.
All right. Well, Thomas, I appreciate you doing part 1, and next time we'll get around to part 2 where you talk about the New Testament itself. I look forward to that episode.